dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you or me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, said he. I never died, said he. The copper bosses killed you, Joe. They shot you, Joe, says I. Takes more than guns to kill a man, says Joe. I didn't die, says Joe. I didn't die. And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, says Joe, what they can never kill went on to organize, went on to organize. From San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and mill, where working men defend their rights, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find Joe Hill. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you or me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, said he. I never died, said he.
Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Harley Shaken, the chair of the Center for Latin American Studies, and we're really delighted to be hosting this event today, this discussion with Adam Hochschild about his latest book, Rebel Cinderella. And as you heard, we began with a song, I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill Last Night, sung by Joan Baez, that takes us to the period that Rebel Cinderella is about. The book really weaves three strands together. One is a biography of someone you may not have heard of, Rose Pastor Stokes. The second is a social history focused on the first 2 to 3 decades of the 20th century that brings a lot of extraordinary dimensions of this deeply troubled time at points, but a time of social movements and engagement. And finally, it is a book that has important relevance to the world in which we live in today. Our format's going to be very straightforward. Adam Hochschild will be showing slides to begin with. Then we will have a conversation and take questions and comments that you're welcome to send at any time over chat. Adam Hochschild teaches at the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. He is a noted author. None of this does justice to the quality and exceptional importance of his work. But in addition to Rebel Cinderella, he is the author of Spain in Our Hearts, Bury the Chains, and King Leopold's Ghost. So with that as a very brief introduction, let me turn it over to Adam.
Well, thank you very much, Harley, and welcome to all of you who are listening here in Berkeley, in the United States, and I understand from other places around the world. I'm going to begin, technology permitting, by showing you a selection of slides and using that to tell you about my book. Now, you should be seeing a slide on the screen there, right? Okay. Wait a minute, something's wrong at my end. I'm trying to find where. Okay, here we go. This book is mainly the story of this woman, Rose Pastor Stokes, a remarkable but forgotten figure. But it's also the story of her very unusual marriage. And that is one which is a window, I think, onto life in this country a little more than a century ago. Its hopes, its illusions, its enormous injustices, which, as you said, Harley, kind of mirror some of the injustices in the United States today. Let me trace her story first. The woman who would become Rose Pastor Stokes was born in Tsarist Russia in the town of Augustów, today in the far northeast corner of Poland. At that time, of course, there was no Poland. It was part of the Russian Empire. She was Jewish, but the Jews of Augustów, or at least some of them, did not live in a separate shtetl because Rose's father, from whom her mother separated soon after her birth, lived above his shoemaker's shop on this central square of the town. He was a cobbler. When Rose was born, the Russian Empire was then under the rule of Tsar Alexander II. He was the good guy Tsar, the reformer, the Tsar who freed the serfs. He also eased a few of the enormous restrictions on Russia's Jews. He was by no means a human rights activist, but he was considerably less anti-Semitic than other members of the Romanov family. However, the lives of Rose and her family and millions of others were upended about 2 years after her birth, hundreds of miles away in 1881, in St. Petersburg, the country's capital, when Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. As soon as he was dead, his successor imposed harsh new restrictions on Russia's Jews, and then there were a series of pogroms over the next 25 years. Hundreds of people were killed, often Jewish homes and shops were burned, leaving their owners homeless. And this, of course, was what spurred the great exodus of hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of Jews from the Russian Empire. And among them was Rose, 3 years old at the time that she left, and her divorced mother. They stayed first for 7 years in London, living in great poverty in the city's East End. And it was there that Rose had the only formal schooling she ever had, less than 2 years. But it was enough for her to gain the ability to read and write in English because she spoke Yiddish at home, and to get a great love for English poetry. When she was 11 years old, in 1890, she and her mother came to the United States, like millions of other people, on a packed immigrant ship like this one. They went immediately to Cleveland, Ohio. And as soon as they got there, Rose had to go to work. No time for school. She had to go to work in a factory making cigars. And this is what she did for the next dozen years. This is the first picture in which she appears. She's third from the left in the back row, or zeroing in here in the middle of the back row in this shot. Age 16, 1896. She did this work as a cigar worker for a dozen years. By the end of that time, she was supporting herself, her mother, and 6 younger siblings who had been abandoned by a ne'er-do-well stepfather. For this, she earned, and she worked often evenings as well as during the day, about $8 a week, the equivalent to about $240 today, mighty small amount on which to support a family that size. Rolling cigars was hard work. The oil and the tobacco seeped into your clothes, your skin. It was impossible to get rid of the smell. The air in a cigar factory had to be kept humid so that the outer wrapper leaf would not dry out. And so the windows were nailed shut in summertime. And at all times, very fine tobacco dust filled the air, and it filled workers' lungs. Cigar workers had the second highest rate of tuberculosis in the United States. Only stonecutters had it worse. And Rose would have lung problems for as long as she lived. When she was 21, something happened that changed her life. She saw a copy of a Yiddish newspaper published in New York City, the Yiddisches Tageblatt, or Jewish Daily News. The paper ran one page in English each edition, and that page invited contributions from readers around the country. Send us your stories, your anecdotes, news of your community, wherever you are. Rose began doing this. The paper eventually gave her a column, an advice column called Just Between Ourselves, Girls. And she was even more amazed that one day she received a check for $2 in the mail, realizing that she could actually be paid for writing. She was still more astonished when, after 2 years, the newspaper invited her to come to New York and to write for its English page there in New York City at double the salary that she was earning as a cigar worker. So Rose arrived in New York in 1903. She was 23 years old. And imagine how that city looked then to somebody who was seeing it for the first time. Skyscrapers like none she'd ever seen before, elevated trains like this one puffing away above the streets, on the streets, trolley cars pulled by cables underneath the pavement, and below that, an enormous subway network still being built, not yet open. And even on the streets themselves, a few of the extraordinary new horseless carriages. Now, New York at that time is a city that would have terrified Donald Trump because it was a city of immigrants. For example, more than half of the men in Manhattan, over 21 years old, were foreign born. New York would soon be the largest city in the world. It was already the largest Jewish city on earth. This is a picture of the Lower East Side, the Jewish ghetto of New York, where Rose lived and worked. Now, it was the people she mostly wrote about for the paper, doing little feature stories, news items, anecdotes, were people like the street peddlers or people who worked in that shop you can see behind me. But one day in the summer of 1903, the newspaper editor gave her a different assignment. He asked her to go interview someone who worked at a settlement house. Well, you've probably heard something about settlement houses. These were institutions of which there were hundreds by this point in the cities of the Northeast and the Midwest in the United States, set up to bring social welfare measures of one sort or another to poor neighborhoods. They provided things like childhood nutrition programs. They provided baths and showers, not just for children, but for adults, because in the tenement buildings in New York City at that time and other big cities in the United States, there were no bathtubs, there were no showers. Settlement houses provided adult education classes in English literacy and other subjects. Now, the interesting thing about settlement houses was that although they served a population that was almost entirely immigrant and poor, the volunteers who staffed them tended to be well-to-do college graduates. This is the settlement house on the Lower East Side, the University Settlement, where Rose was sent to do her interview. And this is the man she was asked to interview, a volunteer who was working there, James Graham Phelps Stokes, called Graham by his friends. And as you can tell from the name, he was Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He and Rose fell in love. Now, Graham Stokes came from the most different kind of background from Rose imaginable. Here, for example, is his family's summer home. At the time that it was built, in the 1890s, it was the largest private home in the United States, in the Berkshire Mountains of western Massachusetts, 100 rooms. Now, legend has it that a brother of Graham's, who was in the class of 1896 at Yale University, sent a telegram to his mother, saying, bringing some apostrophe 96 fellows home for the weekend. The apostrophe got dropped from the telegram, and the mother replied, many guests already here, have only room for 50. Now, when not living in this summer home and another one or two that they had, the Stokes family lived at this mansion in New York City, Madison Avenue and 37th Street. It's part of the Morgan Library today. Here are Graham Stokes's parents. Each of them came from large fortunes, which they combined. Their money came from part of the Phelps Dodge mining empire, from real estate in New York, especially luxury apartment buildings on the Upper East Side, and from a cluster of silver and gold mines in Nevada and a railroad that led to them. Graham's parents had 9 children, and they and some of their spouses and children are in this picture. The boys in the family were expected to play prominent roles in life, and they did. One became a famous architect. One became an editorial writer for the New York Times. One became what today would be called provost at Yale. A grandson became an Episcopal bishop. The girls were not expected to have careers, but rather to marry well, as it said, and they did. One married a nobleman and became a baroness. Another married into the family of a former Secretary of State. Graham Stokes, however, followed a somewhat different path in life than his brothers and sisters. He, after graduating from Yale, he went to medical school at Columbia University in New York. And while working as a medical student on a horse-drawn ambulance, he was exposed to a very different New York than the one he had grown up in. This was the New York of the tenements, and he was shocked by what he saw. Often immigrants living packed 6, 7, 8 people to a room. In tenement houses where often the only toilets were outdoor outhouses like these. And of course, New York City's tenements at the time were notorious for doubling as makeshift sweatshops for the garment industry. Graham Stokes was outraged by what he saw, and that was what led him to become part of the settlement house movement. He and Rose courted secretly for 2 years, and then finally news of their engagement leaked out, probably because a newspaper reporter had bribed a telegraph operator. And it received immense attention. Newspapers all across the United States and Europe and Australia all reported it. This is a page 1 headline from the New York Times. And here it is as the lead story on the front page of the New York Evening World. And as you can see, what attracted attention was not just that it was a marriage between someone extremely rich and someone extremely poor, but between Jew and Gentile, which was something very unusual at that time. So there was both a class and an ethnic difference. Exactly what makes people fascinated with such marriages today. Like, look at all the attention we pay to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. This newspaper immediately signed up Rose to write a series of articles calling her the genius of the ghetto. And then finally, over the well-concealed dismay of Graham Stokes's family, they got married in July 1905, Rose's 26th birthday, July 26th. Graham was July 24th, 1905. Graham was 7 years older. The press remained fascinated by them, and they lived in a blaze of publicity for years. The core of the public's fascination, of course, was that here there seemed to be the Cinderella story. Prince Charming rescues poor, virtuous Cinderella from her humble hearth and brings her to live in his castle, where, of course, love will conquer all the differences between them. Their lives, however, didn't quite fit the script. This is a picture of Rose a year or so after they married. Because Graham Stokes had to some degree left the castle, and Rose had no desire to live in one. Although they often stayed at one of the homes of his parents, it always made her uncomfortable. She and Graham were both acutely conscious that they lived in a country, and indeed a world at that time, with enormous disparities of wealth. Some people lived the way Graham's families did, others were desperately poor and often worked in dangerous conditions as well, like these child coal miners in West Virginia. In 1906, the year after they married, Rose and Graham joined the group that they thought had the best answer to such problems, the Socialist Party. Its leader at the time was Eugene V. Debs, a noble, much beloved man, 5 times a candidate for president in the United States, very much a part of the Second International, the United Socialist Parties around the world. He began his working life as a railway worker, soon had become leader of the Railway Workers Union, and when he campaigned as the socialist candidate for president in 1908, he traveled around the United States in a special train called the Red Special, with red flags and red bunting flying. And of course, if locomotive drivers on a passing track saw the Red Special coming, they gave long, enthusiastic blasts on their whistles because they knew it was Debs's train. Now that year, 1908, Graham Stokes was campaigning as well and was on the platform with Debs when the Red Special came to New York, because Graham was running as socialist candidate for the New York State Legislature from the Lower East Side. Rose campaigned for him. Neither Graham nor Debs won their races that year, but people still remained fascinated by this couple. Everyone still saw them as acting out the Cinderella story. Their marriage inspired 2 novels. Here's one. And this novel, inspired by their lives, or at least the surface of their lives, so to speak, this novel was turned into a silent film. Unfortunately, the film has been lost, but we still have promotional photos from it of the actors playing the roles inspired by Rose and Graham. I have no idea what they're meant to be saying to each other in this picture. Your guess is as good as mine. Now, this was a time when, despite the Cinderella fantasies, it was a time when millions of Americans, even those not living in great poverty, were becoming aware of the deep injustices in this country. One episode that dramatized the terrible labor conditions of the day involved clothing workers, like the ones in this picture. It was a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York City, just off Washington Square, right near where New York University is today. A terrible fire. The workers were trapped on an upper floor. Most of them were unable to escape. There was an inadequate fire escape, which collapsed due to the weight of the number of people on it. The door to a stairwell through which they might have escaped was locked to keep out union organizers. 146 people burned to death, or to escape the flames, leapt out the window to their death. deaths. Of the dead, almost all were women, half were teenagers, almost all were immigrants, Jewish and Italian. 120,000 people marched in a mourning procession through the streets of New York City. 300,000 people lined the streets. And it was issues like this of labor and social justice that Rose was now writing about as she continued her journalism. And also women's rights. She got involved in one case that had echoes of some of the battles still going on in the Me Too era today. A case that drew her attention was that of a woman named Sarah Coton. Coton worked as a nurse for a doctor whose home and office were in the same building in New York City, and she lived in a room the doctor gave her there. One night, he piped chloroform, an anesthetic, under her door, and when she was unconscious, he raped her. A couple of weeks later, she realized she was pregnant. She went out and got a gun, shot and killed the doctor, and surrendered to the police. Rose immediately went to the prison where she was being held, interviewed her in Yiddish, told her story at much greater length than anyone else had. And then Rose announced to the press that she would pay Sarah Coton's legal expenses, and once she was released from prison, would give her and the baby a place to live. The trial of Sarah Coton was delayed until she gave birth, and then she was found innocent, in part because another woman who had been assaulted by the same doctor came forward with her story. In 1909, about 4 years after Rose and Graham married, there began in the United States a wave of strikes, where for the next decade, the country was convulsed by work stoppages and strikes, hundreds of thousands of workers walking out every year. And this was at a time when American labor unions had almost none of the protections they later required. Strikes were often suppressed by the police. These are Chicago police arresting a striking worker in that city, or by troops. These are striking clothing workers in Massachusetts facing state militia. One big strike of garment workers was in New York City. And if you can read the signs in this picture, you'll see they're in 4 languages: English, Italian, Yiddish, and Russian. Rose was heavily involved in the strike, speaking to groups of strikers, often many times each day. And in this strike that began in 1909, she really came into her own as a labor organizer and as an immensely popular speaker. She was soon recognized as one of the great radical orators of her time, and gradually the ongoing newspaper stories about this couple became focused on her rather than her husband. And there's signs that he was not completely happy about this. Now, another strike that Rose got involved in was that of hotel and restaurant waiters in New York City in 1912. The organizers of this strike were from the IWW, the Wobblies, the Industrial Workers of the World, the country's most militant labor union, with a strong sense of internationalism. They walked into one restaurant or hotel dining room after another, usually just as lunch was about to be served, and blew a whistle, and by prearrangement, the waiters walked out. Starting with the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the Luncheon Club of the New York Stock Exchange, on down to many other restaurants. Rose was on the strike committee. She addressed many rallies of striking waiters and their families. She spoke about the miserable conditions in which many of them worked. She wrote about this in the socialist press, and in her papers, there are many letters of thanks from waiters. Now, a couple of the restaurants that were on strike in this hotel, in this particular strike, were in this hotel, the Ansonia, on Broadway between 73rd and 74th Streets in New York. I had several dining rooms. The Ansonia was a famous gathering place for musicians, show business people, and mobsters. Its owner was Graham Stokes's uncle, William Earl Dodge Stokes, or Uncle Will, as they called him. He was a passionate hater of labor unions, immigrants, and much else. And he was absolutely furious that his beloved nephew's wife was organizing his own workers to walk out. He will later come back into this story, you'll see. Let me turn to another aspect of Rose's and Graham's lives. One of the things that made them so fascinating for me to write about was their friends. They knew and worked with the most interesting people in the United States of that era. Here are some of them. That's Rose with Eugene Debs, the socialist leader on the left, and behind them is Max Eastman, editor of The Masses, the best magazine in the country at that time, in many ways sort of a precursor of the New Yorker. Also in their circle was Big Bill Haywood, leader of the Wobblies, the IWW. A strong sense of internationalism, traveled to Europe, knew labor union and socialist leaders there. Haywood was a former miner, cowboy, saloon card dealer, a charismatic orator, famous for using his fists when necessary, and for being able to recite long passages of Shakespeare by heart. Another friend of theirs who worked with Rose closely at one point was John Reed, probably the finest American journalist of his generation, famous for reporting on revolutions in Mexico and in Russia. They also knew Lincoln Steffens, the king of the muckraking journalists of this era, W.E.B. Du Bois, the greatest Black intellectual of his time, Mary Harris Jones, or Mother Jones, great labor organizer, Upton Sinclair, to whose novel, The Jungle, the United States owes its pure food and drug laws. As he was writing it, he sent it chapter by chapter to Graham for his comments. Another friend of theirs is in the middle in this picture, Margaret Sanger, the birth control pioneer. We take access to birth control for granted today, but this Brooklyn clinic in this picture where Sanger appears was shut down by the police and Sanger went to jail. Rose was very active in the campaign for birth control when talking about things publicly was then against the law. Another friend was Emma Goldman, the anarchist firebrand. All of these folks, Rose and Graham knew. They worked with them. Many were their house guests. Some of us left us their recollections of Rose and Graham. Goldman, for instance, and in this picture, she's in one of her many, is in a police mugshot at one of her many arrests. Goldman was always very blunt. She thought Graham was a stuffed shirt and couldn't understand how Rose put up with it. Now, the period of American life when all these people were active was a remarkable time. It was a time when all of them believed that the world could be changed and that somehow just around the corner was an era when a new and more just society would be brought into being. Sadly, though, something happened that brought that period of great optimism and hope to an end: the First World War. And the war not only killed millions of soldiers and civilians, it also shattered the radicals' dream that the working classes of different countries would never go to war against each other. America, however, did not join the war when it started. American socialists and other radicals agitated very strongly for the US to stay out of the fighting. Rose, Emma Goldman, and many other friends joined something called the Women's Peace Party. But finally, in the spring of 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before Congress and asked it to declare war. American troops began going to France, soon in huge numbers, and by mid-1918, they were heavily involved in the fiercest fighting. Here at home, the country was swept by war fever and by ferocious government propaganda, like this US Army enlistment poster. There was also tremendous paranoia about spies. And that paranoia was directed against anti-war radicals. You probably can't read the caption at the top of this cartoon, but it says, "Time for a roundup." And roundups there were. Many radicals still felt strongly that the war was a huge mistake, but they were harassed or arrested when they spoke out. The war created a rift between Rose and Graham. She became firmly convinced that it was a terrible mistake for the United States to join the fighting. Graham was so enthusiastic about the war that he enlisted and went into uniform. He was too old to be sent overseas, but he served in the New York National Guard for several years, never coming closer to combat than marching in parades like this one. Something else that divided Rose and Graham happened in late 1917. The second stage of the Russian Revolution, when the Bolsheviks seized power. Rose was for this, Graham was against it. Rose continued speaking out against the war and now in favor of the Russian Revolution. And this drew the anger of many people, including Graham's uncle, the choleric hotel owner. You remember him, Uncle Will? Here's a report about him from the files of the Bureau of Investigation. And if you can read the words on the screen, you'll see he's recommending to the Bureau, this was the predecessor of the FBI, that Rose has had all sorts of subversive people at her house and that they should search her house. A couple of days later, we know from government records, he called the Bureau, told them that Rose and Graham would be out of town, and so this would be a particularly good time to search the house. The Bureau kept a close eye on Rose. Agents followed her. Stenographers transcribed her speeches. And after one talk against the war, and this was a time when the country very severely punished dissidents who spoke out against the war effort. After one talk against the war, she was arrested. She was indicted under the Espionage Act, the law under which anti-war dissidents were prosecuted, found guilty, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Graham put up money for bail. They appealed the case, and eventually the sentence was overturned on appeal, so she didn't have to go to jail. But by this point, their marriage was on the rocks, in deep trouble. They remained together for 7 more years, but very uneasily because they were going radically different directions in politics. Rose joined the Communist Party, continued to have her sense of internationalism. The last demonstration she ever took part in her life was to get US troops out of Haiti. She went to Russia in 1922 as an American delegate to a meeting of the Communist International. And like far too many people at the time, she thought that in Russia she had found paradise. Graham searched for paradise in a different direction. He abandoned all his involvement in progressive politics and became deeply interested in religion, especially in blending the traditions of Christianity and Hinduism. In 1925, they got divorced very bitterly, and that put them back on the front pages one last time. As soon as they were no longer a couple, the press lost interest in them. But happily for me, they saved all their letters. Rose kept a diary. They wrote dueling memoirs. So I had rich, rich material to work with to try to reconstruct their relationship and the ringside seat they had to a remarkable period of American history. So do historians a favor, keep diaries, keep your letters. After the divorce, Rose, as a matter of principle, refused to accept any alimony, and she was reduced to poverty again. She remarried, but to someone as poor as she was. She soon came down with cancer, and she died at the age of 53 in 1933. Graham also remarried but made no leap out of his class this time. And he lived on to the age of 88, dying in 1960. So that's their story. I wish I could say they changed the world. They didn't, but perhaps through their eyes we can see a world that needed changing and that still needs it today. So, thank you for listening to this. I think I'm going to stop the slideshow here and happy to hear any of your questions.
Thank you, Adam. That was a fascinating overview of the book. There's several short questions I'd like to begin with, and then we'll open it up to other questions or comments that have come in over chat. In the book, you describe seeing a photo of Rose in Moscow in the early 1920s, and that so intrigued you. Can you describe a bit why you wrote the book?
Well, you know, often I find a book begins with one moment where you sort of get an idea or get a question in your head. And many years ago, 25 years ago or so, I was writing a book about the Soviet Union and how Russians were trying to come to terms with Stalinism. So I was reading a lot of Russian and Soviet history, came across this photograph of the American delegates to a meeting of the Communist International in the 1920s. And here was this woman with a very Jewish face, striking looking face, but this extremely WASP last name, Stokes, which I recognized as being from an enormously wealthy family, if it was the same family I was thinking of, in New York City. And I was so struck by this that I made a copy of the picture and tucked it away. I was in the middle of writing this other book at the time and then got distracted on some other projects. But 5 or 6 years ago, when I was casting around for a book subject, I again came across her name in a history book about the early 20th century in the United States. And I realized that I was not the first person to be struck by her. In fact, I realized that during the time of their marriage, she received an enormous amount of attention. You know, there were no databases in those days, but the nearest thing to one was a newspaper clipping bureau, where, you know, you could hire a newspaper clipping bureau to clip out all articles that appeared in the nation's thousands of daily newspapers about a subject you were interested in. The proprietor of a newspaper clipping bureau estimated that between 1918 and 1921, Rose Pastor Stokes was the woman whose name appeared most in American newspapers. There were half a dozen men like Woodrow Wilson and Henry Ford and so on, whose names appeared more often, but no woman more than her. And indeed, if you go today to a searchable database of newspaper articles from that time, you'll find thousands of articles about her. So I thought, you know, this would be a fascinating marriage to explore. And, you know, there were all these letters, there was her diary, there were other documents, there were rich materials to work from. Other people had worked on them occasionally, feminist historians, you know, so there were a few articles in academic journals and a scholarly study here, but I wanted to use their lives not just to talk about themselves, but this remarkable period through which they lived and the constellation of people around them.
The book is beautifully written, and there's clearly a real commitment on your behalf to tell their story, but also the story of the social struggles she was engaged in and the time in which she lived. In what ways might you have been transformed through writing the book?
In what ways was I transformed after writing the book?
Yes.
I don't know. Maybe I still need transformation. I feel I'm the same person I was when I began the book. But I certainly was inspired by the idealism of that time and by, I always get inspired when I see people who are historically or today working to try to make a better world, working to try to make other people aware of the injustices in the world around them. And I always take heart from that because these struggles are still with us. I was speaking about the enormous inequalities of the United States at that time. Well, it's even more so today. If you take the gap in income and wealth between the top 1% of the American population and the bottom 99%, it's greater today than when Rose and Graham got married in 1905. So these struggles are still with us, and I would like to see us approach them with some of the idealism that people from that time have.
And in a way, what the book does, while it's not its focus concerning its relevance for today, it indicates the extraordinary contribution of immigrants in this period to building the country, the appalling conditions so many people lived in, from the slaughterhouses, a place we're returning to today in terms of the COVID-19 virus, but also the important role of the struggles that took place among unions and others to create a more equitable society and to ensure that the people that were making this contribution were sharing in it. Did the labor struggles, in your view, was that a significant part of her life in this period?
Very definitely. Because she was such a skilled orator, anytime there was a strike, especially in the northeastern part of the country, the workers wanted her to come and talk to them. And because she had been working class herself, she knew how to speak about her experiences in a way that would resonate people. She often told the story about how she naively let a cigar factory owner praise her for working so hard, and then realized that he was letting her set the pace of a speed up, where he would lower the piece rate for the amount of cigars that people produced. She was equally skilled, though, in talking to other audiences. She could talk to middle-class audiences, women's clubs and men's clubs, about things like the Triangle Fire and make them care about these things. If she spoke to a religious audience, and you can see looking at the texts of her speeches, she told things in terms of Bible stories. So she had this remarkable skill to speak to people across the class spectrum, to speak in English or Yiddish as the occasion required. And I think this is one of the things that made her so popular as a speaker, that almost any kind of audience, she knew how best to speak to them, move them, make them care.
Great. And then my final question, in an age that we're living in of self-quarantining, I'm going to ask myself a question before we move on to questions and comments that have been sent in, which is, why is the Center for Latin American Studies organizing this event? And there are some fascinating dimensions to this that come out. This is a period, which is so well addressed in the book, of the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, becoming a real force in the United States. Emma Goldman being a very important part of Rose Pastor Stokes' world. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a labor organizer, being part of that. But ideas didn't stop at borders. From 1910 to 1920, the Mexican Revolution is going on.
Yeah.
One of the key protagonists of that is Emiliano Zapata. Some of his key advisors were influenced by anarchist and syndicalist ideas like the Wobblies in terms of advising him in Mexico City. The Casa de Obrero, a small but important labor group, which had real influence on the drafting of the 1917 Mexican Constitution was influenced by some of the socialist and anarchist ideas that took place in the United States. So the way in which her immediate social circle that you mentioned earlier in your comments and that is referenced in the book took place, these ideas were going both ways. Claudio Lomnitz at Columbia University has really explored some of this in a book and articles, and others have as well. So that link may start in New York and travel across the United States, but really was important in a number of ways in Mexico and the other way around. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Julia Bird, who's the vice chair of the Center for Latin American Studies.
Thank you, and thank you to Adam. The first question here comes from Ellen in Berkeley. And the question is, thank you for a wonderful read. Have you sold the film rights yet? I guess what I'm really asking is why you think so little of this crazy, complex story is in the public consciousness.
No film rights yet, but if you are a producer or director, feel free to contact me. Why isn't it in the public consciousness? Well, you know, there are all sorts of heroic figures, men and women from this time that we know far too little about. They're not in our school books. You know, they're not George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or all the familiar heroes, but there's some remarkable heroes. But of course, these were people who threatened the status quo. You know, people like Rose Pastor Stokes, like Big Bill Haywood, like Mother Jones. These were folks who wanted to change the world in drastic ways. And those tend not to be the kind of folks that any country celebrates as part of its official history. I do think one of the good things that's happened in this country in the last 50 years or so is that a couple of generations of radicals and feminists and Black activists have rescued some of these folks from obscurity and made us much more aware of them than we used to be. And if I can be some very small part of that process, I'd be very happy.
The next question comes from Adam Michaels in San Francisco. And this follows up on your comment just now. How would you compare Rose Pastor Stokes' labor activism with that of Mary Mother Jones? Were they influenced by each other? Why are there so few female names associated with the labor movement before the International Ladies Garment Workers of the early 1900s?
Well, it's a good question. And let's remember that even though the International Ladies Garment Workers Union was something like 80% women, for a long time, it had an entirely male leadership. So there were changes that were overdue there. I think, you know, women, like people of color, we have tended to remember less and celebrate less in our history, but there were some extraordinary ones. Mary Harris Jones had a much longer career than Rose did because she lived to the age of 100. And Rose's period of activism during which she was actively, you know, orating to strikers and so on was much shorter, really only a decade or so. And, you know, in part because her life was cut short by illness. But there are many other women that deserve celebration too. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Rose's friend, is one of them. Another fiery labor activist who took part in an inspirational way in strikes like that of the clothing workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Marie Equi, a feminist physician in Portland, Oregon, who was sent to jail for her opposition to the First World War. There are a lot of folks out there who are not known in the way that they should be.
Thank you. And the next question is from Beatriz in Berkeley. Rose Pastor Stokes addressed huge audiences, as you document, and minced no words. She spoke about an exploited working class. Why do workers in the US today identify as middle class, and why are they afraid to join a union?
Well, I think that is the great American myth that you can, you maybe start off in the working class, but you can climb up into that middle class and own your own business and then become a mega millionaire. Although actual social mobility between classes in this country is less than it is in a number of European countries. But of course, the coming to America itself as an immigrant from Europe, where most of our immigrants came from in the time that we're talking about, was in itself an act of mobility, because you left some small village, woe-begotten village in Poland or Russia or Bulgaria or Sicily or somewhere. You came to the United States in hopes of a better life. And so the hope was that you could continue to rise here. And the sense that one might rise collectively through labor organizing, through taking part in the socialist movement, was never as strong here as it was in Europe. And I think that in part is because of the way that immigrants felt they could continue to make that migration upwards, which of course some of them did. Of course, the myth that anybody can become a millionaire if you work hard enough is one that, all sorts of people and institutions in this country and in its power structure have worked hard for decades to try to propagate. And they've been fairly successful at doing so.
Thank you. The next question comes from Amy Ross and to strengthen the relationship between this topic and Latin American studies. She writes from the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Institute at the University of Georgia. Her question is, I like the way you write passionately about passionate idealists. Who would you write about from 2020?
Oh, good question. I think I'd start with AOC. There's all kinds of other people as well. Reverend Barber, Bernie Sanders put a lot of ideas on the table for the first time. I have not been out there as much as I would have liked to be as a journalist in recent years, covering some of the labor and community organizers. But there are some good people doing good stuff. And I think with a little investigation, I could find some more in addition to the ones that I just mentioned. Especially right now, people who are trying to organize workers in these slaughterhouses that Harley mentioned, who are trying to organize domestic workers. There are a lot of folks right now that I wish I was more familiar with, but I'm so deeply embroiled in a book that I'm writing right now that I maybe haven't paid enough attention quite to what's going on immediately in the world around.
I'd like to jump in on that just for a moment very quickly, because I think the book does, and Adam, you have done such a good job of pulling that together. And one of the things that runs through the book is the passion that someone like Rose or Eugene Debs put in this. Not simply personal passion, but the vision that you could create a better world. And that seemed to resonate with people. In the book, Adam, you write that Debs spoke not just of healthcare and decent pensions, but of the way socialism would transform all human relations. Then you quote someone, quote, that old man, Debs, with the burning eyes, actually believes that there can be such a thing as the brotherhood of man. Another socialist once said, quote, and that's not the funniest part of it. As long as he's around, I believe it myself, end quote. And it wasn't just his personal passion or conviction, but this sense that change had to come and we had to move forward. And we may be in a period like that right now. There have been an unusual, even unprecedented number of labor actions, small, but there is a sense that people are not being treated fairly at a time of great inequality, which parallels what took place here. And then one final very brief comment. The most recent Gallup poll indicates that 65% of all Americans have a very favorable impression of unions. The reality is that a little over 6% of workers in the private sector are members of a union. That gap is not solely a sense of, well, we feel we're middle class. I think that gap really points to how difficult it is to join a union in reality. The right is there abstractly. In practice, it is very difficult to exercise.
That's true, although let's not forget we have had a few successes recently in that service workers, food service workers at a couple of the big tech companies, Facebook and Intel, have successfully organized and been recognized just in the last couple of years. And you feel if this kind of thing can happen in Silicon Valley, it can happen elsewhere as well. I sure hope so.
We just have a couple more questions. The next question is from Trant New. Do you know if any members of the Phelps family are committed to social work today? Isaac Hospital for war victims over 50 years ago.
I couldn't quite hear that. Are any members of the Phelps-Stokes family committed to
social work today? Do you know what they're doing today?
Actually, I've met a couple of the members of the Phelps family. Phelps-Stokes family. Graham and Rose had no children, but they're collateral descendants on both sides. The descendants of Graham's brothers and sisters and Rose's brothers and sisters. I met a couple of the Stokeses recently, and they're all doing good stuff, at least the ones that I met. Those were the ones who came to a presentation I did about the book. One guy had been a Peace Corps official overseas. Another one was doing something in foreign aid, development aid. Another was doing something to do with encouraging carbon-free energy sources. I think there are folks out there from that extended family who are doing good things, but I can't talk comprehensively about the family as a whole.
Thank you. And the last question comes from Candace. I hope you are able to answer this one on the spot. She's asking if you can quote a passage from one of Rose's speeches or articles to hear some words that come from her voice.
Gosh, I cannot do it on the spot, I'm afraid. And the reason for it is that there are she never spoke from a text. So we have very, very few texts of speeches, only on 2 occasions when I can think of where somebody else transcribed a speech of hers. One of the frustrating things for me in writing this is that there's account after account, people writing letters to Rose, newspaper reporters writing about her, where people are saying, this was the most inspiring speech I ever heard. A newspaper reporter writing, the audience wouldn't leave the hall even when she left and they turned the lights off. A very worried Republican Party official writing to the head of Columbia University saying, I hear Mrs. Stokes spoke to the students there and got them all riled up. You better ask in somebody else who can give the other side of the story. There's account after account like that. But because she didn't speak from text, and because it's just too early for audio and video historically, I could never actually see or hear her voice. So I'm afraid I can't quote anything really good. If I had the book in front of me, I could dig something up, but I can't off the top of my head.
Well, I would encourage everyone who hasn't gotten the book to get it and to read it. The material in it, and Adam, what you do with it, I think is very exciting. It is both carefully crafted and very, very moving. And to get a sense of the social history of this period, particularly at this moment that we are living through in the United States and so many other places in the world, I think really makes such a valuable contribution. Adam, I'd really like to thank you for doing this and for being here. And we're going to close on a bit of an unusual note. Someone asked about the role of women in the labor movement in this period. And you mentioned Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was a close friend of Rose, who lived with her for several months. She was a little younger, but she was a very committed labor union organizer. And Joe Hill, we began with a song sung by Joe Baez. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night. I mentioned that he was a wobbly organizer who was executed in Utah after a very flimsy trial on a charge he always denied of being involved in a robbery. And this was a song about him, but we're going to conclude about one of the last songs he wrote, likely in prison in Utah, as a tribute to the organizer Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. And it's called Rebel Girl. And in a way, he might have addressed it to Rose Pastor Stokes as well. And this song is sung outside by a young woman several years ago in Utah. It's someone who works as an administrative assistant in a university, and in one of her profiles also works at a hot dog stand on occasion. And we're going to close with her singing Joe Hill's Rebel Girl.
There are women of many descriptions in this queer world, as everyone knows. Some are living in beautiful mansions and are wearing the finest of clothes. There are blue-blooded queens and princesses with their charms made of diamond and pearl. But the only and thoroughbred lady is a rebel girl. It's the rebel girl to the working class. She's a precious girl. She brings courage and pride and joy to the fighting rebel boy. We've had girls before, but we need some more in the industrial workers of the world. For it's great to fight for freedom with the rebel girl. Yes, her hands may be hardened from labor, and her dress may not be very fine, but the heart in her bosom is beating. That is true to her class and her kind. And the grafters in terror are trembling. With her spite and defiance she'll hurl. For the only and thoroughbred lady is a rebel girl. She's the rebel girl to the working class. She's a precious girl. She brings courage and pride